Our reading today is from the Christian Scriptures, the book of Revelation. Here I stand, knocking at the door. If any hear me calling and open the door, I will enter the house and have supper with them. Ancient words for our present day understanding.
Well, you got to eat off easy this week. Yeah. Well, for some reason, I finished my sermon early this morning, and yeah. So I had like an hour extra, which never happens. And that made my mind wander, which probably doesn't surprise you. But I started being grateful for this community. It hasn't been that long ago when doing a sermon like this, I'd probably have charges filed against me. Again, that used to happen a lot. But we've moved past questioning the rights, dignity of any group of people. We're imperfect. We have a lot to learn. We're always stumbling along. But yesterday I was invited to come to the meeting, the Texas meeting of the Poor People's Campaign. And they had the national leadership. Reverend Barber couldn't be there because he said he needed to go to his church every once in a while, and I certainly understand that. But he had a phone call, and the other co-director was there, and the national director. If you don't know the group, they are a continuation of Dr. King's last work, where he realized that the poor and disenfranchised are left out of every group. They're always the bargaining chip that gets thrown away. They're always the place where the waste sites are put. If there's any cut in education, unfortunately, that's the meeting ground between left and right in this country, is to cut off those on the margins. And this is a group that doesn't do that. They call themselves the fusion movement. So whatever your human condition, and they go through them all, you are affirmed, and they are there to represent your dignity. And it felt like being home. It includes so many of the issues that we care about, but it was, wrapped in the principles of Dr. King, which just felt, so good. And what's interesting is, in the past, when I've been in groups like this, and this has sort of been my salvation as a white, heterosexual Christian male, that's a lot of privilege, and you don't tend to be just real smart when it comes to other people's pain when you have a lot of privilege. So being in groups where people were going through enormous suffering, but were doing so courageously, and were able to share with me what their journey was, it gave me my own heart. And that's kind of hard to express. But yesterday, I took notes from people talking. This is people primarily of color, people who are very poor, and the issues in their lives. I mean, think for a second of the problems you had this week. Your iPhone malfunctioned. These were the issues that they were struggling with. Voter suppression. They don't even know if they can vote when it's coming up. Because you have certain kinds of names and you come from certain demographics, your stuff just disappears. Gerrymandering. To them, a living wage is a life and death issue. Moderates are willing to debate that and trade it off. And people's lives are on the line when that's happening. They recognize that the military economy, the military budget that this country is based on, is deadly to them. Privatization, assault weapons, fracking in their area where their water tables become poisoned. I could go on. like that, but you get kind of the point. But the strange thing is that it isn't depressing to be in their midst. It's inspiring because of their courage, because of their shared struggle, and the fact that they, unlike any political group on the mainstream, are not going to leave anybody behind. They're not going to sell anybody out to make a bargain. Incredibly inspiring. I was sitting next to a woman who has struggled with cancer, very young woman, but she lived in one of the demographics where that's where the pollution goes. There's some parts of the country where the cancer rate is something like 700 times average. And as you know, even in liberal communities, that goes to the poor side of town, along with a lot of other problems. But to be with people who have that much humanity is inspiring. It's inspiring. And they're Christians. That's the weird thing these days, because the most recognizable Christians are all on the other side of any kind of social justice issue that you can imagine. Any Christian face you recognize is usually on the side of domination, on the side of colonization, on the side of capitalism. The word evangelism didn't used to mean knocking on people's door to bother them. It meant good news. But it was what a messenger would do if a country had been in a struggle. They would run ahead and say the good news that they had survived. They'd won the battle. And what Dr. Barber said, Reverend Dr. Barber, is that word is always linked with poverty, with the poor, in the Christian message. Do you remember the beginning of the message where Jesus says, I've come to preach good news to the poor? Kind of funny how the church forgot that part, right? That's the part that gets left out. And you go around this country, even liberal churches, and you find a rich white Jesus on the stained glass, reinforcing the false Christianity of the culture. I can't tell you how moving it is to be in the midst of people struggling at that survival level for their own dignity, and yet they give it to each other. The woman who co-directs with, her first name is Liz. She's also a doctor. I'll look it up. I'll put that in the benediction. But she's talking about a story that she'd experienced where a man had died for lack of medical care. The widow gets $1,000 and sends it to the Poor People Campaign so that somebody else might have more chance. See, that's not depressing. That's inspiring. What's depressing is when we pull back from these issues and close our hearts and try to go on like nothing is happening. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel right. We don't feel whole. So this national leader is sitting there crying as she tells the story of the magnificent courage of this one woman whose name we don't even know. Does anybody remember when you were a child and you were learning how to swim? And there was that wonderful feeling of touching the ground? Nobody had that experience, so, okay. Well, we were all great swimmers from the... Well, for me, I remember that wonderful feeling of touching the ground. That's the feeling I get in social justice movements that are just at the gritty, down and dirty survival level. That's the core reality. That's core humanity. And you've experienced that too. How many of you do any kind of hands-on ministry. I'm thinking of people from St. Andrews, but if you're from somewhere else, that's fine too. But the food pantry, the cold weather shelter, the Thursday night meals, or anything that's hands-on ministry to the poor. How many in the church? Okay, leave them up for a second. How many of you feel depressed when you're doing the work? Isn't that interesting? When you go into the midst of the pain, you don't feel depression, you feel inspiration. Isn't that interesting? That's something that we don't think of experientially. That when we close our hearts to our human family, something is wounded inside us. When you do the gospel, you're going to be attacked first and foremost by the church people. But Jesus said that, remember? That was the warning. If you do this love stuff, watch your back around religious people. Right? That's some of the first stuff that was taught. But we can live with that when we have a reason. I remember somebody once said that you're really successful when you can build a firm foundation from the bricks other people throw at you. And we can do that. The criticism doesn't hurt when you realize people are afraid. They're confused. They're lost. They're propagandized. And that's the culture. That is the dominant culture of our nation. The word church, ecclesia, means to be called out of your culture, to be called out of nationalism. Right? If you love America more than you love humankind, that's a rejection of Jesus Christ. Right? When you sit in judgment of your fellow human beings after Jesus taught you not to, that's rejection of Jesus Christ. And just because it's happening at the highest levels of the church doesn't make that any different. But it's important for you to know that you may be traumatized by the church sitting there where you are now and afraid of the gospel for that reason. Afraid of trusting what your heart knows and shouts at you, that it's about love, it's about justice, it's about compassion. And when we do that, we feel our power. One of my favorite mythological stories, it was so funny in seminary, somebody once said, the thing about like Judaism and Christianity is they're the one religion, the basic two religions that don't have mythology. Yeah. We need mythology. We need the stories that come unwrap it. But one of the stories that I love is Antaeus, and ants are named after him, I think. But this is Wikipedia, so it's got to be true. Antaeus would challenge all passerbys to wrestling matches and remained invincible as long as he remained in contact with his mother, the earth. In Greek wrestling, opponents attempted to force each other to the ground. Therefore, he always won because staying in touch with the ground gave him invincible power. It says that he built a temple to his father using their skulls, which for the capital campaign, that might be... No, let's not do that. Let's not do that. But the way Hercules defeated him was to lift him off the ground. His power came from the ground. Our power comes from the ground of things, from the real. It doesn't come from being an optimist or a pessimist. It comes from being in touch with the real, in love with the real, able to cope with what's really there. Again, if we shut our heart down, short-sighted, trying not to feel the pain of our human family, we feel an even worse pain. And so in our scripture today, Jesus is coming and saying, I stand at the door and knock. I believe that Jesus is a symbol, a mythological story, talking about life. And Jesus is speaking as life itself, trying to get through to us, trying to get through the doors that we have shut to life and to love. If the mythological stuff doesn't seem real, in physics, everything's interconnected. And any two objects that come into contact with each other exchange energy. So life affects us when we're open to it. We languish when we are not open to it. So many of the things that we consider to be challenges and frightening things may be life knocking at the door of our closed heart, of our closed off life. Something that seems like a problem. Your problem or somebody else's problem. You look at the issues of the world and you just shut down. Now sometimes you have to. You can only take so much pain. And shutting down, pulling back from it is a part of the ministry. But when it's always shut, when the United States destroys Guatemala and a mother and her son come up at our borders and we think they're strangers, we are the ones with the empty heart. We are the ones in poverty because our hearts are dead and empty. In the picture of this scene where Jesus stands at the door and knocks, if you look carefully in the classical picture of Jesus at the door, there's not a doorknob. And I think that's what that's saying is a lot of times we're wanting something to come from outside of ourselves to inspire us, to change us. And we have to open it from the inside. It requires consent. Reverend Barber, when he called in, he had a problem with traditional church. I just don't understand it. But he's used to trouble. Most times the picture when you see me is being arrested. So, when Christians say Christianity isn't about helping the poor, but about prayer in schools, hating gay people, and voting Republican, that is not only a lie, it is a heresy. Now, the Poor People's Campaign is nonpartisan, kind of like I'm nonpartisan. But once a political party attacks your human family, there's no such thing as nonpartisan. Nonpartisan means universal human rights. And if somebody isn't getting them, don't call that nonpartisan. Don't call that moderate. To cut off the people on the margins who are trying to survive desperately. In the story, the part that I didn't include, I've been kind of haunted by that. I need to tell you that the part we quoted comes after where Jesus talks to a church that was just lukewarm. A typical liberal church, neither hot nor cold. Right? For inclusive meant non-committed. Right? And he says, because you're neither hot nor cold, I spit you out. That should be a warning. When moderates say they're going to meet in the middle, what they're saying is they're going to have the people of privilege are going to come together and have a unity based on cutting somebody else off. When you study the great virtues, moderation was about your own appetite. It wasn't being moderate about somebody else's justice and human rights. I sometimes think the most arrogant position of all is to think you're in the middle. To think you're not a part of the violence that you see all around you in the world. And that you can live in your comfort zone and be innocent of the blood you see all around you. I think what a prophet would say to America today is, you will not cross into the promised land if you leave the poor behind. It's not going to happen. You will not pass into the promised land if you leave people with disabilities behind you. You will not enter into the promised land if the rights of people of color are not equal to your own. You will not enter into the promised land if LGBTQAI people are not a part of the solution. If a prophet were here in the United States, I don't know that he would have suggestions about who to vote for. But I think he would remind America that Jesus was a socialist. And if you don't like it, choose a different religion, please. Please, you cannot read the Christian scriptures and not get that people are more important than money. I don't know who you need to vote for. I'm not saying that. But I'm saying if human happiness and universal human rights are not your goal, then please don't say you're following Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ was a socialist. Get over it. Was anybody here when we went down to the detention camps to do the protest? There were two buses. So anybody here that was there? Okay. Do you feel in your bones how that trip changed this church? It became real. When you looked at children in concentration camps, it became real. It wasn't just an issue. It wasn't something you argue about. You realized your human family was in pain, and your great honor was the calling to stand by their side. When I was sitting there yesterday, amidst all these courageous people, a little voice in the back of my mind said, it's time for another road trip. In June of this year, in Washington, D.C., they're going to gather for the Poor People's Campaign. Remembering Dr. King's work. He died standing up for the garbage workers when he was assassinated. I think it's time we took a trip. Because all of the issues that we care about come down to this. That everybody should have the same rights. They call it a fusion movement. And they say we're not an organization, we're an organism. Right? It's not just a cause. It's universal humanity. And what an honor to be invited to share in that struggle. What they did yesterday, because this is such painful work, they would do chants and songs. And one of the things they kept saying, and I invite you to repeat this and see how it feels to begin to activate, to begin to move even one step towards your values and your hopes. I believe everyone born has a right to life, a right to live. Would you repeat that? I believe everyone born has a right to live. I believe everyone born has a right to learn. I believe everyone born has a right. I believe everyone born has a right to health care. Everyone has a right to health care. I believe everyone born has a right to a home. I believe everyone born has a right to a home. I believe everyone born has a right to a living wage. I believe everyone born has a right to love. Well, you get the point. How does that feel? How does your heart feel when it says it's truth? We often feel powerless. Not because of what's happening in the world, but because we've shut our hearts down to survive. That's very human and very understandable. And sometimes you have to do that. Resting and healing is an essential part of the struggle. But at some point, we remember that our human family needs us. That while we are being comfortable and moderate, people are dying. People are languishing in prison while we stay in our comfort zone. So, if you want that feeling of touching the earth, then come to the reality that people live out in your human family. I'm going to close with 3 quotes because I couldn't choose between them. Pretty typical, huh? First is Mike Murdoch. He said, "You will never change your life until you change something you do daily." I like that. Dr. King said, "Take the first step in faith. You don't have to see the whole staircase, just take the first step." And then finally, Confucius says, a very compassionate, "It doesn't matter how slowly you go, as long as you do not stop." I invite you to your own reflection on these words.